Everybody ready for the poetry reading, the poems that I would like to share with you. I told Dr. Horde when she asked me to do this that, to be honest with you, I had not written very many poems about sports. So a lot of the material you'll hear tonight is brand new. Some old, some new. You all will be kind of my guinea pigs in terms of some of the new stuff that deals more directly with sports. But I just wanted to thank Dr. Horde for inviting me. I feel very honored to be a part of this Focus Week. I think it's a very timely discussion in light of all of the things that have been happening in the world of sports recently, from the media referring to Richard Sherman as a thug to the domestic violence issues that have been brought up with Ray Rice, Adrian Peterson, who is dealing with the possibility of being brought up with child abuse charges. There is a lot going on right now in the media as it pertains to sports directly. So this will be a very timely discussion that will take place over the course of the week, and I'm excited to be a part of it. But I will start off with a poem that just kind of speaks to the Black experience, in my opinion, how in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of struggle, we are somehow able to still find ways to celebrate, still find ways to persevere, still find ways to maintain our dignity in the midst of oppression. And so we'll start off with a poem that I wrote called Celebration. Black folks know how to struggle like trapped birds who have filled their cages with song, like muscles that have been torn and stretched before becoming strong, like lumps of coal that emerge as diamonds after being burned and pressured too long. We struggle in style, we suffer and smile, we grieve and we grin. We don't break because we bend, because we know God will never give us more than we can handle, which gets us through in the clutch. We just sometimes wish he wouldn't trust us so much. Yes, we play the hand that was dealt us with ease. Who else could turn chitlins into delicacies? Who else could take the N-word, as much as we hated to hear it, and turn it into a term of endearment? Who else could turn slave songs into coded incantations that led to freedom from master's plantation? Who else could take the pain that accompanies truth, give it a soundtrack, and call it the blues? Who else could be broke yet still dress sporty, make a smooth entrance even when arriving tardy, and turn an eviction notice into a rent party? Who else, in the midst of pain and emotional confusion, could turn the tragedy of a funeral into a family reunion? Now, the Apostle Paul told the church at Rome what my grandmother taught me when I was a child at home: for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So I speak with all of the courage that has been instilled in us, with the strength of the blood and the sweat that has been spilled for us. May each season of celebration rebuild in us what our oppressors have tried to kill in us. Because who else but a great and mighty nation could take the incessant injustice that we've endured and turn it into a celebration? Yeah. So there is a poem that I'd like to start things off with. I was not very athletic as a child. I was more the guy that hung out at the library rather than the basketball court. But from a very young age, I was always a huge fan of Muhammad Ali. And in fact, I brought two posters that actually hang in my house. Brought some friends along, three of people that I have huge admiration for. And I have these posters hanging in my house because they inspire me. I draw strength from them because the men that are in these photographs really lived a life that I want to emulate. And so in this poster that's right before the podium, you have Muhammad Ali knocking out Sonny Liston. And I think that in many ways, it speaks to the emergence of a new kind of thinking. Although this was a boxing match, I think Muhammad Ali represented a new way for athletes to have an impact on the culture. And not taking anything away from Sonny Liston, but I don't think those kinds of things, the things that Muhammad Ali was thinking about outside of the boxing ring, I don't think that Sonny Liston was headed down that same path. And so I think that this moment really marks a new trajectory in the world of sports. And so I wrote just a brief poem, a sonnet, in fact, based on this photograph. And Dr. Hoard in her introduction had talked about my interest in ekphrastic poetry, which is merely poetry that is written in response to a visual image, whether it's art or a photograph, that kind of thing. So for those of you who know, he knocked him out in the first minute of the first round, right? So that's the title of the poem, First Minute, First Round, a sonnet. If you were a butterfly brash and brown, then Liston was a wing-weary moth tricked by the flame in your glove. First minute, first round. Like bad sex, it was over just that quick. Your phantom punch and unsuspected ping, like Monk's finger on a startled key, a percussive approach used in the ring, filling Liston's head with fierce cacophony. That night, there was a changing of the guard. In less than 2 minutes, the switch occurred. The ancient Negro hit the canvas hard. From his ashes, the new black man emerged. You are now trapped in tremors, but I still see you lording over Liston like a king. Sonnet, very brief poem, 14 lines. All right. So, you talked about your partnership with the Negro League, and I worked at the American Jazz Museum for 10 years, and in those 10 years, had several opportunities, several missed opportunities to learn more, to spend more time with Buck O'Neil. And, to be honest with you, I didn't take advantage of those opportunities. Usually when Buck was coming in, he was on the move. Those of you who knew him, he was a very busy man, very vital. He always had stuff going on, and it was really sometimes difficult to catch Buck by himself because people loved him so much. And so, to make a long story short, I just figured I'd have that opportunity at some point. One of these days I'll catch him by himself and we'll sit down and we'll engage and I'll really have that opportunity. And unfortunately, I never did before he passed away. I mean, he was always very cordial. He was always very nice, but I really wanted that opportunity to sit down and really spend time with him, and that never happened. So shortly after Buck passed away, I wrote this poem, and I just wanted to open it with a quote from Buck after he was not voted into the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame, and it just, to me, is indicative of what an enormous spirit Buck had, because everybody was really upset, everybody was angry, everybody felt that he had gotten shafted, and his response to all of that was, God's been good to me. They didn't think Buck was good enough to be in the Hall of Fame. That's the way they thought about it, and that's the way it is. So we're going to live with that. Now, if I'm a Hall of Famer for you, that's all right with me. Just keep loving old Buck. Don't weep for Buck. No, man, be happy. Be thankful. He was just always so gracious and always so larger than life. And so the poem is titled, Got It and Gone. On the evening of Friday, October the 6th, 2006, the Mars rover Opportunity sent back the first color photographs of the Victoria crater. Condoleezza Rice met with Kurdish leaders to protect U.S. oil interests in Iraq. King Jong II thumbed his nose at the world community and moved forward with nuclear arms testing in North Korea. The Oakland A's swept the Minnesota Twins in Game 3 of the American League Divisional Series, and an earth-shattering silence echoed down the Prospect Corridor as John Jordan Buck O'Neil took his final breath. In that moment, the Grim Reaper swallowed his pride and grinned. Old Buck couldn't find the time to stop for death, so death kindly stopped for him. Yes, Buck was a beautiful man, a good black don't crack prince of a man. He was our urban griot, our rapier raconteur, sharing glorious stories that were blueprints for liberation. In the years since his passing, I can't help but think about all the missed opportunities, the conversations I should have initiated, questions I should have asked, other than, "How you doing, Buck?" As it turns out, that was the last question I asked him. And when I did, he smiled, then folded my right hand into those great big hands of his, those hands that bled in Floridian celery fields, those hands that fielded dirt balls rifling down the first base line, those hands that caressed Ora Lee for 51 precious years, those hands that gracefully rested on a podium in Cooperstown after the awful news. And he said, "Man, I done got it and gone." Then breezed through the door onto 18th and Vine, beaming with the brilliance of the fulfillment of a dream. So I noticed that one of the books that was on the PowerPoint was $40 Million Slaves. And I have not read it from cover to cover. I thought it would be a good book to pick up as I was preparing for tonight. And there's a chapter on, each of the chapters are divided into sections that, contemporary athletes are facing. And in the chapter, there's one chapter titled The Dilemma of Neutrality. And it talks about how, when we look at Muhammad Ali and him being willing to sacrifice, the best years of his life as a boxer, to be a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and the way he spoke out against injustice and things like that. There are a lot of athletes today that we respect and admire. Some even are worshipped, but we just don't see that kind of fire coming from them, not as consistently as we did back in the day. And so in his book, William C. Roden, and he's talking about Michael Jordan specifically, but how he epitomizes this neutrality or this kind of detachment that we sometimes see coming from black athletes. And he has this to say: Michael Jordan is one of the most intriguing athletes of the 20th century, a sports icon like Babe Ruth, but not a paragon of principle like Muhammad Ali. Jordan was a marketing maven who never capitalized on his potential to mobilize African American athletes. Had he said jump, they would have jumped. Instead, he chose to remain publicly neutral in all matters political and racial. The essence of Jordan's legacy is what he accomplished. The tragedy is what he could have done. All right. And so with that kind of as a backdrop, this next piece was inspired by this very iconic photograph, which I also saw in the PowerPoint, of Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics. And that was a huge year in the civil rights movement. I mean, there were so many things going on. I mean, Dr. King had just gotten assassinated. There had been riots all over the country, and it was the high point of the civil rights movement. And the Black Panther Party was active at that time. And so for these two young men, 23 and 24 years old respectively, to take the risk of that gesture, of just that fist in the air, on the world stage, was it was just enormously courageous. And so that gesture has inspired so many people. And so it just leaves me to think, with so much work left to do, and not to be overly critical of anyone, but why we don't see that coming from more black athletes today. So this poem is called Two Fists in the Air. This is one of the brand new ones. I get winded when I bend over to tie my shoes. Lost the last game of horse I played to my 8-year-old nephew. Could not connect a Louisville slugger to a baseball thrown underhand from 3 feet away. Need my girlfriend to decode the rules of the gridiron on Sunday afternoons. And I try to sound like one of the fellas when sports talk ensues by offering platitudes like, I think they might go all the way this year. But oh, the fear that widens my eyes if anyone stops to ask me why. But my inner athlete is released, like Mercury racing across the sky on winged feet whenever my eyes happen to meet the stunning photograph of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, fists raised defiantly on the global Olympic stage, embodying both universal solidarity and black rage. I am a champion taking my stride to the winner's circle to stand beside all those who came before me, like Isaac Murphy, Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, Jackie Robinson, Wilma Rudolph, Althea Gibson, Arthur Ashe, and of course, Ali. But the reality never escapes me that Smith and Carlos knew that it would cost. That one small gesture led to a lifetime of loss. But the brothers did their thing anyway, which is to say they sacrificed their livelihoods in service of the greater good, which begs the question I must raise. Where is the congregation of heroes in sports today? Where are you, Michael? In a sweatshop in Taiwan, trying the new pair of Jordans on, making all those young brothers in the hood absolutely adore them, though their single moms can't afford them? Where are you, Tiger? Working on your sexy gland so you can get into some white girl's pants, calling yourself Cablinasian, but that nanny knew better. Like we all figured that to white folks, you still a nigga. Where are you, Mayweather? Got 2 fleets of luxury cars, but hell, you can't drive but one. I wish you'd roll it into Ferguson. Fight for justice tooth and nail, like you fight for all those championship belts. So I raise a fist for Tommy Smith and John Carlos, hoping that I will be counted among those who offered their lives while striving for the crown, because to build a better world, sometimes you have to tear the old one down. And so, I do a lot of work with young people, primarily, in the urban core, and these are their heroes. You got the hip hop artists, the entertainers, and the athletes, and especially the young men. I mean, they really look up to, admire, try to pattern their lives after these men and women, and so. One of the poems that I'd like to share really deals with not necessarily athletics, but why it's so important for people who have that kind of a platform to use that in a way that can help young people especially kind of see their ways out of some of the things that they're confronted with. And so this poem speaks to a time where I was working with a group of young men who were just really, really hard-headed, really difficult to work with. They just were not open to the process of using poetry and the art programs that we were exposing them to as a way to kind of deal with some of their issues. And I was so frustrated. But the more time that I spent with them, the more I learned their stories, I realized that they were confronting things that, I simply had never had to deal with, growing up. And so once I really kind of got inside what was going on in their lives, it was a lot clearer to me why I was having those problems. But this poem is dedicated to them and to the hope that, athletes and other people who are in those positions will use that platform in a much wiser way. So this is called The Prodigal Poem. This poem is unwanted. This poem is illegitimate. This poem was an accident. I didn't mean to write it. Yes, I let my pen touch the pad, but I was just scribbling, just doodling, just playing around with it like so many other poets before me. See, I thought the paper was on the pill, so I didn't use any protection. No correction tape, no whiteout, no eraser. I wanted to have it aborted, but by the time I had saved up enough loot, it had already reached its third stanza. The paper won't consent to an ink test, so I'm not claiming it. However, I see it hanging out in the hood sometimes. This poem lets its word sag so you can see it's behind. This poem wasn't raised right. It can barely even rhyme. This poem hangs out with weed papers and it drinks too much wine. This poem will be dead before it reaches its 21st line, crumpled up in some wastebasket next to a suicide letter, or tragically executed by a heartless paper shredder. At the very least, it will end up locked behind the bars of some legal pad, and it'll be too late then to blame it on Dad, whoever that may be. No, this poem won't end happily. It's already lost touch with reality, heavily influenced by BET. It's caught up in some warped hip-hop fantasy. It denies the genre to which it belongs. This poem thinks that it's a rap song. P to the Izzo, E to the ism. That's the anthem. Get all your hands up. This poem will never be published, revised, or anthologized. This poem will never reside on a library shelf because this poem is illiterate. It can't even read itself. This poem could never be a real love poem. It's too busy trying to be a Mac Daddy poem, but countless careless encounters have made it a "that's just my baby's daddy" poem. And it has left fatherless verses in journals and notebooks all over town. With each passing line, it sinks further down. Now, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and not just these, but Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon yearned for this poem to follow them. These prophetic poems that foretold of the coming Messiah and the glory of the New Jerusalem reached out to this poem, prayed for this poem, loved this poem. But some poems just don't want to be saved. They just crash and burn at the bottom of the page. So another quick departure here. I just felt that with everything that's going on in Ferguson, I should at least have one poem that kind of touched upon that. And I'll be honest with you, this is a poem that I had written after the Trayvon Martin decision. And, you know, knowing that, you know, until huge strides are made, you know, this is just going to continue to happen. And we just cannot allow ourselves to get desensitized. We can't allow ourselves to back away from it. So it kind of came from an angry place, you know, to be honest with you. I guess it is what it is, but I feel like the day is coming where black people are going to get fed up. You know what I mean? Like, we're fed up, but when we get fed up and start demonstrating how fed up we are, and I don't mean in demonstrations, I mean really showing how fed up we are. And so this is called Black Tide Rising. If you listen closely, you can hear it. When the moon sits low, full and heavy on the edge of a blood-red sky, in that twinkling of a moment when day is swallowed by night. You can hear it when the hums of the metropolis are muted by darkness and the flesh of your heart thumps against its cage of bones. It is the distant roar of the rising tide, a 400-year-old tide, racing swiftly across the Atlantic. It carries the remains of 50 million dead ancestors. It is teeming with the metallic taste of blood. It knows nothing of satellites or systems of meteorology, so it can't be traced and it can't be stopped. The shore cannot contain it. This tide is deep, dark and unruly. This tide is a massive mountain of melanin rushing to occupy whiteness. This tide is 39 million niggas rolling Cadillacs over your manicured suburban lines, tilting 40s in your country clubs, dicking down your daughters and filling them with black babies. This tide is certain. This viscous, violent, volcanic tide courses with the power of memory. It remembers Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, Bobby Hutton, Amadou Diallo, Yusef Hawkins, Tawana Brawley, James Byrd Jr., Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown Jr. It remembers the invisible names of all the countless victims you chose not to put in your newspapers. This tide knows the names of white folks too, so watch out. Rand Paul, Trent Lott, Mitt Romney, Karl Rove, Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, J.P. Morgan, Mr. Monsanto, Mr. De Beers, Merrill Lynch, George Zimmerman, Officer Darren Wilson. And y'all thought Katrina was bad. This tide is inevitable. This tide is supernatural. It is seething with the paranormal ooze of 13,000 ghosts in hoodies. This tide is ride or die, and it collides with the impact of 41 shots to the dome. This wave of sea sudsing with holy water is a reaper, and it ain't about rage or revenge or reparations. It's about retribution. This rising tide of dark tears can't be diminished, diked, or damned. And like the one who is I am, it is omnipotent as it is omnipresent, which is to say it is everywhere, so beware. Its waves are crashing soon. There is a book that I would suggest. I don't know how many of you are, poetry fans, but there's a book that I recently read called The Big Smoke. And poet Adrian Matejka basically does a poetic biography of Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson, was just very just larger than life, and I don't even know how to describe his personality, but I mean, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to be as brash as he was, to openly date white women, to really just express his masculinity in a way that was very intimidating to white people, just demonstrated like a kind of courage that you don't often see. And the poem deals with some of the complexities of Jack Johnson's life. Like any of us, he struggled with certain things, and he was a complex individual. But the poem that I would like to share with you really quickly is called Race Relations, and it speaks to the night that he fought Jim Jeffries. It was July 4th, 1910. And Jack Johnson had been knocking so many folks out that white people were looking for what they termed the Great White Hope. Who can we find that can beat this nigga? You know what I'm saying? And they were not very successful. And so when Jack Johnson won that fight, there were riots, race riots, all over the country. It got so bad that hundreds were injured, and from what I understand, over 20 people died that night. And it was, a lot of it was black people were so excited and celebratory that they were having fun, and white people just, they couldn't take it. They had to crush that. And so this is called Race Relations. The president of Talladega College said it was better for me to have beaten Jeffries and let a few coloreds be murdered in the riots than for me to lose and allow their spirits to be killed. I quit 5th grade to load cotton steamers, and even I know the spirit is no good without the body. All that violence, just because my black fists were too many for a pair of white fists. If they had any manhood, these people wouldn't fight at all. The truth is, whites are supposed to know better on general principle. The fellows making trouble over my victory at Reno didn't have anything to do with it, and they don't have any class. If they knew the real Jack Johnson, they'd behave themselves like he does. It's called Race Relations. One other one I would like to share out of this book really quickly is the opening poem, and it's called Battle Royale. And from what I understand, back in the days of Shakespeare, they would have this bear baiting kind of thing where they would have dogs that would fight bears. They would chain the bear to a stake in the ground so the bear couldn't get away. And oftentimes, to give the dogs a fighting chance, they would either gouge out the bear's eyes or they would take out the bear's teeth. It was just a brutal thing. And so it was eventually outlawed. But that's kind of the backdrop that leads into how Jack Johnson got his start in boxing. And so this piece is called Battle Royal rather. Back then they chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson, that was one of the bears that was really well known back then. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wild cats alike. And since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handlers sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it seemed like I got hit from 8 different directions. I don't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard my shoulder hasn't been right since, because the man said only, the last darky on his feet gets a meal. All right, so, and I don't know how far we've come from that, but that was from The Big Smoke. Any of you interested in Jack Johnson or poetry or, that type of thing, that is a very good book to read, and it, has great notes in the back that kind of detail his life and some of the historical events that were going on at the time. So I actually just have one more poem to share, but I have a special guest that is here in the audience tonight. And this poem is a poem that I just want to give you a little information about before she comes up to read it. As Dr. Horde said, on and off for the past couple of years, because I work and I'm involved in a lot. I haven't been in school every semester, but I've been working on this MFA for quite a while now. And sometimes just run into issues in terms of, my aesthetic choices, sometimes run into issues based on, my use of the black vernacular. And this isn't a criticism or pointing the finger, but, it's just one of those things that come up when, you have people from different cultures trying to look at art. They bring their own experiences to the table. And so one of the style books that we were asked to read was by this poet, Tony Hoagland. Tony Hoagland is an enormously celebrated figure in the world of contemporary poetry. He's won all kinds of awards, and he really kind of carries himself as this kind of a liberal, moderate liberal maybe, in terms of some of the politics that I've heard him express in his interviews. But what happened was we were reading this style book by Tony Hoagland, and I said, well, if the professor is saying this is a book that we should really be using in terms of learning more about the craft, I want to see some of his work. So I started going to look at some of his books and things like that. And so I came across this poem that you are about to hear, and it startled me, and I'll tell you a little more about what happened afterwards. But the poem is called The Change. It was written by Tony Hoagland, And Dr. Jacqueline Wood is going to read it for us because, we're also looking at this thing, I've dealt a lot with race, but I did want to at least touch upon, this idea of gender, and this poem, is written about a woman. So I wanted to hear a woman's voice in terms of reading this poem. So if you all would welcome Dr. Jacqueline Wood.
Stare, and I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top, because she was one of my kind, my tribe, with her pale eyes and thin lips, and because the black girl was so big and so black and so unintimidated, hitting that bow like she was driving the Emancipation Proclamation right down Abraham Lincoln's throat, like she wasn't asking anyone's permission. There are moments when history passes you so close, you can smell its breath. You can reach your hand out and touch it on its flank. But I don't watch all that much masterpiece theater, and I could still feel the end of an era there. In front of those bleachers full of people in their Sunday tennis watching clothes, as that black girl wore down her opponent, then kicked her ass good, then thumped her once more for good measure, and stood up on the red clay court, holding her racket over her head like a guitar. And the little pink judge had to climb up on a box to put the ribbon around her neck, still managing to smile into the camera flash, even though everything was changing. And, in fact, everything had already changed. Poof! Remember? It was the 20th century almost gone. We were there. And when we went to put it back where it belonged, it was past us, and we were changed.
Clapping for Jackie, not the poem, right? So, just to add a little, brief commentary, thank you so much, Dr. Wood, for reading that poem. So, once I went back to class and said, hey, I found this really interesting poem by Tony Hoagland, and I kind of want to talk about it because I'm troubled. And some of the takes were, and this is true, oftentimes when you're in a poetry workshop, if you've written a poem, we'll refer to the work, whoever's voice we hear, as the speaker in the poem, because that doesn't necessarily represent the voice of the poet, who the poet is, what he thinks. There are also poems that are called persona poems, where you just take on the voice of somebody else and write the poem from that perspective. And so it was kind of, this light conversation, but that's all he was doing, and I get that. But I was just really troubled because I don't know how much of that was persona and Tony Hoagland, how much of that was the speaker in the poem and Tony Hoagland. And in a way, I kind of appreciate the poem, as strange as that may sound, because, racism is so tricky nowadays. You know what I mean? We have people who, are really very, they consider themselves to be very open-minded, very liberal, and they're not in touch with the way that they've been socialized. Something will come up, and then they'll kind of realize, okay, maybe I do have this, element of racism in me. And for him to go ahead and put it out there like that, at least you kind of know what you're dealing with, rather than, the smiling face and, oh, I would never say or do anything like that. So it's a very complicated poem, but at the end of the day, I'm writing the response to whoever was saying that. You know what I mean? And the title of the piece is called The Same, after Tony Hoagland's The Change. When the moon is over Venus and the light beams off her racket, just before she turns it into a hammer and John Henry's the puke green ball into some white girl's dream like a railroad spike, when her sculpted arm arcs at the speed of prayer, with a follow-through that stops time, the curve and the line of her rump and thigh, a vision of feminine geometric perfection. When she punctuates the power of her serve and everywhere is heard a resounding rah! For the briefest of moments, oppression crumbles, injustice subsides, tyranny tumbles, freedom is in sight. For that nanoscopic speck of time, we almost believe that things could change. But when the match is over, we are met with the changing same. The same slavery, newly expressed in the prison industrial complex. The same de facto segregation now in the guise of gentrification. The same overseers, just a new sort, are now officers for the police force. The same political disenfranchisement, the same substandard education, the same menial jobs, same low pay, same old shit, different day. Oh dear white poet, you express such dismay at the loss of white dominance in a Eurocentric game. Tell me, why is it white folks feel they have to run every damn thing? Isn't the resilience of global white supremacy enough to ease your pain? Or what of the ubiquity of white privilege? That certainly hasn't changed. So your lament of Venus's heroic athleticism I find difficult to understand. I say stop your fucking whining and take it like a man. All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed yourselves this evening. I certainly had a lot of fun being here. I am very excited about the rest of the programs that will take place this week. And go Royals!